Listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello and good evening. This is Don Swans, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the January 11th issue of the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Front page, where we always start. Picture of the dictator Juan Vicente Gomez, who ruled Venezuela from 1908 to 1935. He sits arrogantly staring at the camera. The title of the article is, "Can Trump Make Venezuela an Oil Giant Again?" It's written by Daniel Yergin, Vice Chairman of S&P Global, is the author of The Prize and Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power, and The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. No one was paying any attention to Venezuelan oil 2 weeks ago. A longtime oilman said to me the other day, but now everyone is. Donald Trump made that happen. Following the dramatic seizure of dictator Nicolas Maduro by American forces on January 3rd, the president declared that the U.S. would take control of the country's oil industry, with Venezuela turning over 30 to 50 million barrels for the U.S. to sell, the proceeds being used to benefit the people of Venezuela and the United States. But that's just the beginning. Trump has made clear that he wants U.S. oil companies to return to Venezuela in a big way. There's certainly plenty of oil to be produced there. Venezuela holds the largest reserves in the world, more than Saudi Arabia and the U.S., and for decades was one of the stars of the oil world. But recent years have brought a crushing descent. The Venezuela has been producing well under 1 million barrels a day, less than North Dakota, and accounts for less than 1% of world oil production. Estimates range widely for what it would cost to bring back the industry. One reasonable guess is $20 billion to boost Venezuela's output to 1.5 million barrels a day from the 870,000 barrels it produced in November. To get back to the 3.4 million barrels a day of peak production at the end of the 1990s could cost $100 billion, or even more, including new facilities, infrastructure, and environmental remediation. But what will it take to persuade companies to make such big bets on Venezuela again? The country's state-owned oil company, devastated by years of corruption and political turbulence, doesn't have the money or technology for a recovery, let alone a massive upgrade. The international oil companies who do will want to be confident about security, regulation, and the legal foundations of their investment. Given that Venezuelan across the spectrum include most of the 70% of the public that voted against Maduro in the last election, believe the country's oil resources belong to the nation and are essential to the recovery of their battered economy. Any real plan for reviving Venezuela's oil industry has to reckon with the political legacy of the country's long, turbulent history with its petro riches. The hunt for oil in Venezuela began before World War I in unmapped jungles, whose hazards included giant mosquitoes, malaria, and hostile native tribes. One driller, sitting on the porch of a mess hall, was killed by an arrow fired from the nearby jungle. The results of the hunt were so disappointing that in 1922, an American geologist dismissed the country's petroleum prospects as simply a mirage. But as so often happened in the history of oil, when just about everyone is about to give up on a new geography, a discovery proves them wrong. Later that same year, Royal Dutch Shell, the Anglo-Dutch company, found an oil field so huge that the initial well flowed at 100,000 barrels a day. That set off an oil rush that drew in more than 100 U.S. and British groups. An oil boom engulfed the country. Within 7 years, Venezuela had gone from nothing to become the second largest oil-producing country in the world, behind only the United States. Oil became the foundation of the economy, generating 90% of export earnings. No one benefited from the boom more than the country. More than the country's dictator, the avaricious and brutal General Juan Vincent Gomez and his family. They showed remarkable business acuity in selling the rights to new oil concessions to companies eager to get into the game. By the late 1940s, more than a decade after the death of Gomez, a reformist group won control of the government and demanded a new arrangement with the oil companies. In a deal partly brokered by the U.S. government, oil proceeds were divided into a 50-50 principle, with companies paying taxes and royalties to the government equal to half their net profits on the oil. The new terms, plus expanding production, led to a six-fold increase in government revenues and contributed substantially to the country's impressive post-war economic development. There could be no doubt that Venezuela was now well established as a petro-state. But the 50-50 deal didn't last long. Nationalism would change the balance, with Venezuela passing a law in 1958 to increase its share to about 60%. In 1959 and 1960, international oil companies, facing a surge of new supplies from the Soviet Union, cut prices. That in turn reduced the income of the other oil exporting countries. In response, an infuriated Venezuela took the lead with Saudi Arabia in establishing a new organization called the Organization of Oil Exporting Companies, better known as OPEC, OPEC, to defend their interests. OPEC's founding was a sign of what was to come. As markets tightened in the late 1960s and early 1970s, in the face of rising demand, a wave of nationalism swept over all oil-producing countries. Venezuela nationalized the company's positions not through confrontation, as in some other countries, but by a process of tough negotiation. Long-standing oil concessions were fashioned into 4 government-owned operating companies, staffed by Venezuelan nationalists who had been trained and worked in the international companies. The new state companies kept their links to the former owners in order to maintain technical skills and to make sure the oil could get to market. The 4 operating companies were under the National Oil Company, PDVSA, which existed both for coordination and, importantly, to provide a buffer between politicians and the operating companies, to guard them against political interference and to reduce corruption. When I visited Caracas in the 1990s, meeting with PDVSA and its subsidiaries was like meeting with any other professionally run international company. But at that moment, the Venezuelan economy was already in deep trouble. Population had doubled in just 2 decades. Per capita income had fallen, and inflation was high. The only obvious way to bolster the economy quickly was to increase all earnings. And the only way to do that was by substantially boosting output. But PDVSA could not do it alone. It had neither the investment capital nor the technology. The country's answer during the 1990s was the Apertura Petrolera, the oil opening. International companies were invited to come back to Venezuela, bring their technologies and investment, and work once again directly, not as owners of concessions, but rather as partners and operators. The plan met violent opposition. Nationalists charged that the sovereignty of Venezuela was being violated once again, and that control of the country's oil, which had been wrested away from foreign companies, would be undermined. No one more vocally opposed the Apertura than a charismatic army colonel named Hugo Chavez, who had been imprisoned after leading a coup in 1992. By the time of the 1998 presidential elections, the country's economic crisis had become worse. The price of oil, the lifeblood of the economy, had collapsed to $10 a barrel. Running as an outsider, Chavez amnestied from prison only 4 years earlier, when the presidency won the presidency, though with a total turnout of just 36%. Once in power, Chavez wasted little time in dismantling the democratic system, centralizing all power in his hands and that of his clique, under the rubric of his Bolivarian revolution and his motto, Socialism for the 21st Century. He rewrote the Constitution, eliminated one house of Parliament, undermined the Supreme Court, and took direct control of PDVSA and its enormous revenues. Cubans arrived to help Chavez cement his control. Parents decried the Cubanization of school textbooks, and Chavez took to playing ball, literally, with Fidel Castro, pitching against him in a game in Havana. Castro's team won 5-4. Most important, Cuba won subsidies and oil supplies from Venezuela, a lifeline for its own economy. Castro placed Chavez as his political son and sent his secret services to help protect the Venezuelan strongman. There is only revolution and counter-revolution, Chavez declared, and we're going to annihilate the counter-revolution. Chavez had the good fortune of rising oil prices to help bolster his regime. But by 2002, most Venezuelans had grown weary of his increasingly dictatorial rule. Mass opposition and a coup briefly deposed him, but after 3 days under guard on a military island, he helicoptered back to Caracas. At the end of that year, a general strike brought the country to a halt. Oil workers stopped working. Oil output fell to almost nothing, and exports ceased. The shutdown lasted a couple of months. When it was over, half the workforce was fired. Most of the foreign investment under the Apertura had gone into the Orinoco Belt, a 54,000 square mile region rich with oil, but oil so thick that it would not flow by itself. Before Chavez came to power, a half-dozen companies had entered into contracts with PDVSA to produce the oil, which required extra investment and extra technology. But Chavez would not have it. In 2007, dressed in red fatigues, he descended on the Orinoco to announce the true nationalization of our natural resources and thundered, "Down with the USM bar." Behind him was a poster declaring full oil sovereignty, the road to socialism. Most of the companies left and went into arbitration, which, after lengthy processes, left them with judgments that went largely unpaid. In 2013, Chavez died and was succeeded by his vice president, Nicolas Maduro, a former bus driver who had risen through the union movement. He had held various jobs under Chavez, including foreign minister, but had none of Chavez's charisma. What he did have was the capacity to run a highly repressive dictatorship that would imprison and torture opponents, or even those who had wandered into a protest on the streets. He also presided over an economic disaster as the country, through mismanagement and corruption, suffered simultaneously from both hyperinflation and deep recession. At one point, gross domestic product declined by 35%. By one estimate, 75% of the population was living in poverty. Crime was endemic, and cartels turned drugs into big business. Out of desperation, 8 million of the country's 30 million fled as economic refugees, mostly to neighboring countries. For decades, Venezuela had been a petro-state, but under Maduro, the country hardly even made the grade. Over the course of his presidency, production fell 60% and was actually 75% lower than when Chavez had come to power. For oil companies now thinking of returning to Venezuela, the immediate problem is the wreckage left by Chavez and Maduro. The oil industry had been in a state of continuing destruction of assets and value because of lack of investment and maintenance, corruption, and political control, said Juan Zabel, a former senior official of PDVSA. For 2 decades, corruption and theft reached from the top of the government down to the field, where unpaid workers sold off drilling equipment and metal from pipelines to pay for food. Talent fled the industry, with many of the most capable managers in exile. And PDVSA itself, once one of the most respected state oil companies in the world, was turned into a political machine and a piggy bank for the regime, which is still very much in power even after Maduro's arrest. Some larger companies may return to Venezuela in the hope of somehow collecting billions of dollars of unpaid debts, and some smaller companies and entrepreneurs with a high tolerance for risk will certainly look for opportunities there. But none of this promises a full-scale revival of the once mighty Venezuelan oil industry. For that to happen, there will have to be a more fundamental change in Venezuela's politics and policies, and also in the readiness of companies to make a new deal with a country, despite the ruin left by Chavez and Maduro, is still committed to the idea that it should control its own oil. The current situation reminds me of a conversation I had with the CEO of one of the major international oil companies on the eve of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. You know what I'll say to the first person in our company who comes to us with a proposal to invest $1 billion, he said. He'd ask them about the new regime's legal and political system, economic and fiscal standards for contracts, arrangements for arbitration and security. Tell us about all those things, he added, and then we'll talk about whether we're going to invest or not. Venezuela today is very different from Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and 2025 is not 2003. But similar questions will be on the agenda before billions of dollars of investments start to flow into Venezuela. And the answers will have to be worked out. And that will take time. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And now, looking at things on a different page, let's look at this article. A picture of perhaps Socrates. He's got his hand on his chin, and he's looking out at the world behind great pillars. The article is written by James Traub, who's written a new book, The Cradle of Citizenship: How Schools Can Help Save Our Democracy, which will be published by W. Norton this week. I arrived in Founders Classical Academy of Louisville, Texas in September 2023. and found my way to the gym of the lower school, where the K through 5 students gather every morning. Usually the kids from one grade recite a poem they've memorized. Today was Patriot Day, a state holiday, and the 4th graders recited the preamble to the Constitution. From "We the people of the United States" all the way down to "Ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." I was sitting on the bleachers with the 3rd graders, and we all applauded. Established in 2012 in this Dallas suburb, Founders is the oldest of a network of 23 classical schools, chiefly in Texas and Arkansas. The Founders Network is one constellation in an expanding galaxy of about 275 classical charter schools across the country, including private Catholic and Protestant schools that call themselves classical. About 250,000 students now attend such schools. If you live anywhere outside the Sun Belt, you may never have heard of this movement, though it is one of the fastest growing school reforms in the country. Classical education is largely a red state phenomenon. To liberal critics, these schools represent the thin edge of the wedge of cultural warfare. A 2023 report by the Network for Public Education, an advocacy group, describes the terms classical and traditional as dog whistles to attract conservative families with Christian nationalist identities anxious to place their children in schools that reflect early and mid-20th century values, pedagogy, and curriculum. Founders headmaster Jason Kairos rejects the allegation of Christian nationalism, but argues that there is much to be said for those traditional values, pedagogy, and curriculum. Kairos and his faculty are engaged in what they regard as a countercultural project, working against the grain of a progressive utilitarian culture that they believe offers too little to children and demands too little of them. The school's Latin motto is Scientia Virtus et Libertas, or knowledge, virtue, and liberty. Founders does not offer classes in civics. The school's very reason for being is civic. One morning I sat in on Daniel Bishop's 6th grade English class. A plywood arch bearing the words Caius Caesar, preparing for triumph, had been fastened to the door. The kids were getting ready for the annual Roman pageant. There was a brief discussion of togas and other Roman paraphernalia. Then Bishop got down to business, telling the kids to stand up and recite Shakespeare's great Sonnet 65, the one that begins, "Since brass nor stone nor earth," they did flawlessly. Bishop told me later that it helped the kids parse the difficult phrases and imagery. Then it was time for oratio, oral presentation. The class was reading The Count of Monte Cristo. A girl volunteered to get up and summarize the chapter. When she came to the chief themes. She spoke of false identity, people misrepresenting who they really were. Bishop pointed out that Count Morcerf had a strange name, which could be translated as dead deer. He asked, "Are there dead deers in mythology that are significant?" Everyone seemed to know the story of Artemis, who turned Actaeon into a stag and allowed him to be torn apart by the hunting dogs. Here was the founder's model in miniature: classical knowledge, truth and beauty, memorization and public speaking. The vibe was eager. My conversations with teachers at Founders kept circling around the difference between the classical and the progressive ethos in education. They did not use the word in its conventional political sense. No one ever spoke the words critical race theory, or woke, or even Joe Biden. No doubt they thought about those things in their private lives, but as classical teachers, their concerns lay elsewhere. They objected rather to the orientation of conventional schooling, which they used interchangeably with progressivism, toward the market and toward college readiness. Karos recounted for me with real horror a story he'd recently heard about a school where teachers in each grade met weekly to review student test data and then draw up individualized plans. That would, in fact, count as state-of-the-art pedagogy in many schools. Karos' reaction had been, "You can't have a school like that and teach beautiful content." In fact, John Dewey and other founders of the progressive education movement in the early 20th century were deeply anti-utilitarian. Dewey regarded the vocational orientation of education as profoundly anti-democratic because it limited real intellectual development to the college-going elite. But it is true that for progressive education, school begins with the child and her interests and developing faculties, not with the subject matter and its intrinsic nature. The liberal ideal is individual development. Education allows each of us to become not the ideal citizen, but whoever we wish to be. What makes classical education fundamentally different is that it does not regard individual autonomy as the supreme good. Rather, it believes in what Aristotle called eudaimonia, a word typically translated as happiness or human flourishing. Education is ultimately a form of training, above all, in reason, that makes the good life possible. In The Politics, Aristotle wrote, "There is a certain kind of education that children must be given not because it is useful or necessary, but because it is noble and suitable for a free person." Louisville has a self-selected population. although like most charter schools, it chooses students by lottery. Those who attend are the ones whose parents wanted them to go. Dallas is one of the most conservative big cities in America. The school draws from church-going, conservative pool of families. But the kids are not privileged. The median income is slightly below the American average of $74,000. 45% of the 935 kids at Founders are white. 22% are Asian. 20% are Hispanic. And 7% are black. The traditionalism, rigor, and discipline of classical schools, the thick wall against peer and popular culture, appeals to many newcomers to the U.S. As the school's reputation has spread, immigrant families have applied in increasing numbers, so that the lower grades are much more diverse than the high school. This reflects a larger trend. A 2023 study found that while enrollment in classical charter schools in Texas had grown sevenfold over the previous decade, growth among Asian American and Hispanic students had far outpaced growth among whites. The culture of Louisville Founders suited the culture of its community very well. But a gay student, a trans student, even a mildly rebellious or slightly weird kid, anyone disinclined to be compliant, might have been unhappy there. The wild variety of American life can never be clamped down on the Procrustean bed of a single form of schooling. Yet Carlos, who now serves as academic director for the Founders Classical Academies, and his colleagues are right about the failures of conventional schooling. Sixth graders elsewhere do not read novels. High school students are not asked to elevate their gaze to the beautiful and the true. As Kairos put it, if we want to maintain our individual liberties, our societal freedoms, and flourish as a people, we must have a well-educated and virtuous citizenry. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Now, this title is intriguing. The Point of Retirement. Enlightenment, or at least calm. More and more people are finding reasons to stay on the job well into old age. They may be setting themselves up for a difficult end. It's written by Mark Edmondson, a regular contributor, who's a professor of English at the University of Virginia and author of The Age of Guilt, the Superego in the Online World. Winter is the season when the most Americans retire. But this year's retirement wave may be a little smaller than last's. There seems to be a growing consensus among the accomplished and influential that you should never surrender your occupation. Peter Thiel thinks retirement is for losers. Ben Shapiro says that 65 is way too early to pack it in. And Elon Musk is not giving up until there are humans on Mars. And maybe not even then. Even a half-century ago, in her brilliant book, The Coming of Age, Simone de Beauvoir was commending a long life of perpetual action. More projects, more ventures. I get it. I'm 73. Love my job at the University of Virginia and had no immediate plans to walk away. In fact, there was a time I got annoyed when anyone pushed me on the subject. When are you going to retire? You can't teach at UVA forever, can you? When this began about 10 years ago, my answers were sometimes a touch impolite. The subtext, and sometimes the text, was often, mind your own business. In time, I came up with a saner reply. I'll keep working, I said, as long as I can do my job reasonably well. That satisfied most of my interlocutors, and it satisfied me. I was encouraged in this wish to go on by my grad school advisor, Harold Bloom, who kept churning until the end, writing books well into his 80s. It said that he was dictating more criticism on the gurney that carried him to his final operation. He said that he never thought about death and that he would never retire. They can take me out by the heels, I heard him say. By the heels. I wanted to follow his lead. But lately, I've come to think I might be wrong. Retirement may be something that a person truly needs, though not for the standard reasons. The established image of prosperous and happy retirement is well known. One travels to see alluring sights. I've had my eye on Mexico City for a long time. One socializes with friends. 40 years in Charlottesville has brought me many smart and genial ones. One picks up a new sport, though you'll have to count me out for pickleball. The puck, puck, puck sound sends me around the nearest bend. That all sounds fine. But is it possible that there might be a deeper meaning in the idea of retirement? Maybe it's a phase of development, not unlike childhood, youth, and middle age. Those phases have their goals. The child matures, leaves his family, and becomes a part of the human community. The young person finds a vocation and maybe a mate. The middle-aged person consolidates his gains and harvests what he's sown. If you ask the Dalai Lama, whose work I've been studying off and on for the last 30 years, what retirement is for, he would, I think, answer that it's for enjoying your life in a decent, compassionate way. But he would also tell you that retirement is about getting ready to die. To the Dalai Lama, all of life should contain some preparation for death, but that preparation should become more important than the last phase. According to the Dalai Lama, you want to leave the world in as calm and composed a way as possible. You want to be fully present at your own passing, with a mind clear and, if possible, not clouded by medications. You want to you want to do all you can to move beyond the very human fear of death and get as close to tranquility as you can. You can do this through meditation. While you meditate, you brood on the impermanence of all things, including yourself, and envision yourself as a corpse lying out on a bier, all life gone. This will happen. It's inevitable. Hindus commend a phase of life that they call sannyasa. In it, an elderly person gives up ownership of worldly possessions. He, usually it is a male, but not always, leaves home, puts on a saffron robe, picks up a staff and beggar's bowl, and begins a life of wandering. He puts aside distractions so he can focus on the life of his spirit and the prospect of death. I'm still churning away in my professional life. It will be hard, maybe impossible to prepare for what is coming. It may seem noble never to retire from work and think about the end, but doing so may make you panic when the prospect of the end becomes manifest, especially if you feel that it has come too soon. And who wouldn't feel that way? Montaigne said that everyone believes he has 10 years left to live, no matter how dire his condition. But death comes when it will. Why does it matter if we go out calmly or kicking and squalling? The Dalai Lama believes that it will be easier to bear if we pass calmly to the next life. And if death does not take us completely by surprise, there will be less pain for us overall, less suffering, as dramatic rehearsals make the play easier to perform. Rehearsing our end might make it smoother. There's also the effect we have on the people who love us and whom we love. No one wants to be remembered as a ranting, near madman or woman, though on a certain level there's plenty of reason to rail against death. In his best known poem, "Do not go gentle into that good night," Dylan Thomas passionately urges his father to fight against death to the last breath. Rage, rage against the dying of that light. A friend of mine, a good and kind woman, spent her last days raging at everyone close to her. She told them her very worst thoughts about them. She could not contain her rage against the doctor, a friend who she felt had misdiagnosed her. She did some serious damage to her family. Not irreparable, but serious damage. As for me, I can't pretend to be an expert on this daunting subject. There are days when I think that I'll be teaching at the University of Virginia nearly forever. I believe I have 10 years left, and then next year I'll still have another decade to go. At other times, wiser times, I believe, I'm able to take the guru seriously and begin to imagine the inevitable end. Begin. No better than that. The guru is one who dispels illusions, and there is perhaps no illusion so insistent or potentially more harmful to the individual than the illusion that he will live forever. To enjoy a comfortable retirement and still follow the Dalai Lama's advice, we may need to follow Shakespeare's Prospero, a magician who tells us what he will do with his wand and book of incantations when he retires. I'll break my staff, bury it certain fathoms in the earth, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book. He also resolves to think regularly on death. Perhaps this can be done in the midst of the hurly-burly of the professional world, but it's not easy. It will be hard for me to go without the class preparation, those lively students, and even, I think, the grading of papers. But choosing retirement may be the best way to get ready for what is to come. Joe Queenan is a regular contributor, and an excellent one, to the review under the heading Moving Targets. He's got a very interesting title this week. It's "The Feds Need to Bail Out the Pizza Industry." The automobile industry got one. Banks got one. Why not give a bailout to our nation's formerly second most popular food? In depressing news for traditionalists, Americans are steadily falling out of love with pizza. A deeply troubling report in this paper says that while pizzerias were once the second most popular type of restaurant in this country, they now rank 6th, lagging behind coffee shops and eateries selling Mexican-style food. Evidence of the pizza apocalypse is everywhere. Chains are closing. Major franchises are considering putting themselves up for sale. And the entire industry seems desperate to find a way to rekindle America's passion for a gastronomic and cultural touchstone they once revered every bit as much as mom, country, and apple pie. And that's going to take money. That is why the prospect of a federal government bailout of the pizza industry seems so timely and appropriate. Every time the car industry falters, it gets a bailout. When things go south in the soybean fields, farmers get bailouts. Banks get bailouts, airlines get bailouts, railroads get bailouts, and all sorts of other wounded institutions, including Amtrak, have been able to look to Washington for substantial financial assistance. So, why not pizzerias? That is not to say that the pizza industry is entirely blameless for its imperiled status, steadily rising prices, calcified and uninspiring menus, and even outmoded decor have all contributed to the decline of a dining option that arrived on these shores in the late 1800s, when immigrants from southern Italy began selling pizza on the sidewalks of New York. Pizza then exploded in popularity after the Second World War, when returning servicemen brought home a seemingly universal passion for the tasty comestible. Soon, even the humblest burr in the hinterland could lay claim to a flourishing pizzeria, or two. But just as the car industry was blindsided by the arrival of cheaper, more fuel-efficient vehicles from Japan, The pizza industry has been slow to react to the rise of other dramatically different fast food dining experiences. Everyone from Chipotle to Starbucks has hammered pizza purveyors and their companies, perhaps feeling betrayed by fickle consumers, do not seem to know how to respond. That's why a federal bailout of the industry is imperative. Pizza purveyors could start by figuring out a way to make pizza easier to eat. At no time does the industry ever seem to have addressed the fact that pizza slices are really hard for little kids to hold, that the unwieldy slices often buckle and half the cheese ends up splattering onto the kiddies' clothes, thus turning them against pizza forever. This is a design flaw that can no longer be ignored. And the industry in general seems reluctant to adopt such artisanal pizzeria. Innovations as lavender-flavored pizza, honey-drenched pizza, or vegan pizza made with cashew ricotta. An industry as hidebound as this one is going to need time to retool and figure out what way to address shifting consumer tastes. Just as the American beer industry eventually realized that it might be a good idea to develop a product that actually had some taste, the pizza industry may be in need of a full-scale makeover with entirely new products and more talented chefs. It may be even time for pizzerias to consider experimenting with less obvious ingredients. No, Americans may not be ready for pizza made with Camembert, Gruyere, or Stilton, but some sort of innovation along these lines may be necessary if the industry is to survive. Once mighty tech companies that refused to accept the rise of the personal computer quickly disappeared. Car manufacturers that continued to churn out hideous gas guzzlers have long since vanished. The pizza industry could easily suffer the same fate. Not every industry is worthy of a massive federal bailout. The American people owe nothing to companies that supply fast lube jobs, nor need they feel beholden to cupcake makers, cobblers, tax preparers, or manufacturers of cheap lingerie. Pizzerias are different. Pizzerias are generally iconic retail establishments that define what it means to be an American. For the American people to turn their back on them would be the unkindest cut of all. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the January 11th issue of the Wall Street Journal Review. We read from the Wall Street Journal Review every Thursday at 7 p.m. Your reader tonight has been Don Swans. And as always, truly I mean that, we thank you. Thank you very much for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the New York Times. Following that at 9 o'clock is Fortune Magazine. And at 10 o'clock is episode number 9 of Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Stay with us for these readings and more. Stay with us for these readings. If you or people you know shop at any of the Dash's supermarkets, please save Dash's register tapes for radio reading. Our agency receives $2 for every $100 in Dash's register tapes. Radio reading has raised thousands of dollars so far. Anyone can drop off their Dashes tapes to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service at 11. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision,